Hey guys, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to take a look at BLUETTI's new release. This is their entry-level Elite 30 V2. And as far as I can tell, it's basically a re-release or an updated version of their older EB3A. So it has 288 watt hours of battery capacity, and the AC inverter is rated for a continuous 600 watts with a peak rating of 1200 watts. It's got up to 200 watts of solar, and the input specs on that solar are 12 to 28 volts with a max of 10 amps. And that solar input, by the way, is now an XT60 connector, which is much appreciated since that is so much more ubiquitous than the older style connectors they used to use. And as you can see, it's got a couple of 3-prong AC ports on the front. It's got your standard 12 volt, 10 amp car socket. It's got a couple of DC 5521s, and those are up to 8 amps, so 12 volt, 8 amps. Then it's got 4 USB ports. 2 of these are your 15 watt Type A older style. And then you've got one, oh, actually I thought it had 2 PD100s, but it's only got one PD100. The other one is actually a PD1 40 watt, which is actually a bonus as far as I'm concerned. Now, it does not have wireless phone charging on top, and it does not have an area light anywhere that I can see. And it weighs in and I'm kind of a ridiculously, laughably light 9.5 pounds. So super easy to manage. Now, in terms of its dimensions, as you can see, it's also extremely small. But in terms of the actual dimensions, it's 9.8 inches in this direction. It is 7 inches deep in this direction and 6.6 inches high. So nice and compact. Now, in terms of cables, it just comes with an AC charging cable and a car charging cable that you can plug in right up here on that XT60 port, but no MC4 solar cable. And I think that's actually pretty reasonable because on a power station this size, it's less likely that you would be charging it via solar, but if you wanted to, you can pick up a cable for cheap on Amazon. And it is compatible with BLUETTI's mobile app, and we'll take a look at that at some point. And it does have a 5-year warranty, despite its pretty impressively low price, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. But enough spec talk, let's go run this thing through the paces and see how it stacks up. All right, since power station in this particular size class is going to be probably heavily relied upon for the DC outputs, let's go ahead and do the DC usable capacity test first. And I'm going to see if I can get the full 10 amps out of this 12 volt socket here. And then we're going to find out how many watts we can actually get out of that rated 288 watt hours. So right now you can see over here, we are reading 13.382 volts. And let's go ahead and put that under load by starting the test and see if it'll hold at 10 amps. All right, 10 amps is no problem, and we are at just about 12.5 volts under load. Let's run this thing all the way down. And the fact that we're at 99% already makes me think maybe I didn't have this thing quite topped off. But let's just see where we end up on this guy. All right, looks like our DC discharge capacity test is done. Let's zoom in here and see how we did. As you can see on the display, we got 263.5 watt hours. Now that's out of that 288 watt hours, which is a surprisingly good 91.4 or 91.5% of usable capacity out of that DC port. And that's a very strong usable capacity number. I think some of that is due to the fact that it probably doesn't have to step down the voltage to 12 volts. But yeah, I mean, under any circumstances, I would be very happy with that number. So yeah, good stuff out of the DC port. So let me get this charged back up and we'll try the usable capacity test out of the AC ports. All right, we are fully charged back up. Let's do a usable capacity test out of the AC inverter. So I'm going to use my little watt meter here and turn the inverter on. And let's first check and see what kind of voltage we're getting. 120.6 volts. Excellent. Let's go ahead and apply a load. This is going to be about a 200 watt load. 210 watts. Okay, so we are off to the races. So we'll go ahead and let this run all the way down until the BMS shuts the power station's discharge off. And then we will check the meter and see how many watt hours we actually get out of that rated 288. All right, looks like our AC discharge capacity test is done. Let's just see where we ended up. Let's make sure that we are actually at 0%. Yep, 0%. So let's connect this to grid power and see what we got. All right, we got 255 watt hours out of that rated 288 watt hours. So that is a very respectable, slightly higher than average, 88.5% of usable capacity. So pretty decent numbers for a small little power station in usable capacity out of the AC inverter. All right, time for this solar charging test. And we want to make sure that this thing will wake and charge in the morning when it's fully depleted once the sun comes up again and begins supplying power. So we are at 0% state of charge. As I've said before, this handles up to 200 watts maximum and a max input voltage, which is the most important spec, of 28 volts. So I have got a 200 watt solar panel, and it is outputting about 20 volts. So we're well within that spec. So I'm gonna go ahead and plug that in there. Now it's about 8:40 p.m. So I don't think we're gonna get really anything coming in on the input, although I did just hear a relay click, but I don't see anything on screen. So yeah, anyway, so we're gonna see this thing is gonna kind of go into shutdown mode. In fact, I'm gonna just go ahead and turn it off. And we will check back in the morning and see if it starts to solar charge as the sun comes up. All right, it's about 11 a.m. the next morning, and I don't see any action going on here. And there is plenty of sun out right now, so we definitely would be seeing something. If it were going to do something, let's just try turning it on and see if it'll start charging. I heard a relay click. And we are now charging. So it looks to me like if you power this completely off, you are not going to be charged. There's no wake and charge. So it has to be in a standby state to begin waking and charging. So good to know. All right, so I'm going to leave this plugged in with one 200 watt solar panel, and the sun's not quite aligned yet. And these panels typically only output about a maximum of about 175 watts. So we're going to see if this is sufficient to charge this in a single day with a 200 watt solar panel. Should be, but we'll verify that and check back later. All right, it is 3 p.m. and I got a notification on my phone just a little bit after 2 p.m. saying that this little guy was fully charged. And as you can see, that's still basically true at 99%. We are taking in a little bit of solar, which is kind of interesting. So that 200 watt input spec on the solar max is actually more than enough to fully charge this thing off in really just like 3 hours or so with pretty decent sky conditions. All right, let's do a noise check on the AC output of this little Elite 30 and find out whether or not it injects noise into amplification systems, because I know that's a somewhat common use case. So let's get a baseline comparison of how this thing sounds off clean grid power first, and then we will repeat the test on the AC output of the Elite 30. So here's the baseline on grid power. All right, pretty clean. I will have boosted that about 9 dBs just so you can hear it. I'll do the same for over here. So let me switch the AC cable and we'll see what's different, if anything. Turn on the AC inverter. All right, same test from the inverter on the Elite 30. All right, once again, this is one of those test results where this is a definite pass in my book, although I'm sure you will have heard a very slight difference. And keep in mind that I boosted that very significantly by 9 decibels. In person, the difference is negligible. There is not enough noise coming out of this crotchety old guitar amp to give me any concern as a musician. And this guitar amp has no noise suppression and is fairly sensitive to AC line noise. So, noise test is definitely a pass. All right, time to do a load test on this little Elite 30 and make sure that that AC inverter can really sustain that rated 600 watts of continuous output. And we're also going to monitor the voltage while we're doing this using my little watt meter here. Without any load at all, we're at 120 volts. So we want to see if this thing is going to be able to maintain this for a full 10 minutes. So let me put a timer up here and we will kick that off just as soon as we get as close as we can to that 600 watt threshold. I've got the AC inverter on now. So let me go ahead and start adding load and see how close that gets us. I think this should be pretty close. And it looks like we are there. So let's start the timer. All right, 10 minutes, no problem. And we stayed pretty steady at that 119 volts throughout that entire load test. All right, as you can see, we're still maintaining steady at that 600 watts. Let's try pushing that a bit. See if I can take that up another 100 watts and see what that does. All right, we are 656 watts, 660, still climbing. So far, so good. Let's see if we can find out where it trips. This might do it. 722. So we're 125 watts overrated. We haven't tripped yet, and we finally tripped. All right, so a little bit of headroom on that 600 watt continuous rating, but regardless, it does definitely pass the 600 watt load test and gives you just a little bit more if you need it for a short period of time before it shuts down the way that you would want it to. All right, let's do a UPS test on this little Elite 30 V2 and see if it can switch over from grid power to battery power fast enough to keep my gaming PC from shutting down. So I've got gaming PC, I've got the monitor and the sound system all plugged into a surge strip that is plugged into the AC power. If you look in here, we are currently outputting about 473 watts. And of course, I'm inputting grid power over here. And if you look over here, you can see we're inputting 353 watts. Now that is a net input to the battery because as you can see, we're actually charging the battery as currently sitting at 76%. So let's simulate a power outage by pulling grid power from the side here and see if the gaming PC will still continue to run uninterrupted. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. Right, no change. We are still up and running. Everything looks completely fine. And by the way, if we look at the screen here, you can see we're continuing to output 478 watts and we are inputting no watts right now because we disconnected the grid power. So let's see if it will switch back over to grid power in reverse without creating an interruption. So power is restored, heard the relay, and we are now inputting 347 watts. And this didn't change. The computer stays up and running. So UPS mode on this little Elite 30 is definitely confirmed. Okay, now I did also test the no load or idle consumption on the Elite V30 600 watt AC inverter. And I did it for a full 12 hours. And I started with 100% state of charge, and 12 hours later, I had just 49% charge remaining. So doing the math on that, that's about 4.25% of the overall capacity for every hour that you leave this AC inverter on, which comes out to about 12 watts continuous. And this is actually fairly typical for these lower capacity power stations. So you definitely want to make sure that you keep that eco mode setting enabled to make sure that you don't inadvertently run the charge all the way down if you happen to forget to turn off that AC inverter after you're done using it. Now, I did mention at the beginning of the video that the V30 is supported by BLUETTI's mobile app. I'll just pop that kind of up here on the screen for you so you can take a look at it, and we'll kind of run through the app real quick. And as you can see, gives you very clear visual on the current state of charge as well as the input and output power. And as you'd expect, it allows you to remotely control both the AC and the DC outputs. And if we open the quick settings menu there from the bolt icon in the upper right hand corner, we can set whether we want the default connection to be Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, which is something I actually appreciate since my Wi-Fi out there in the metal barn is not always great. And if I scroll down just a bit further, there's a bunch of other things that you can control. So just to focus on what I think are probably the most interesting features, you can actually set the working mode, which is set to standard UPS by default, and that prioritizes grid power for UPS mode. But you can also set it to things like PV priority, which obviously prioritizes solar over grid charging when both are available. And then you can also set it to something like time control, which actually allows you to create a schedule to charge it off of grid power when your electric rates are the lowest, which is a nice feature, but probably something you're more likely to use on higher capacity power stations when you're maybe using them in a emergency backup power scenario, like with a manual transfer switch connected to your house. So that's probably not a common scenario for something in this capacity class. But moving on to charging mode, this is where you can specify the charging rate to be either fast or slow or custom, somewhere in between. And that's all depending on whatever your specific needs are. And as I've mentioned a bunch of times previously in other videos, I think it's always better for the long-term service life of the cells to kind of charge at the slower rate rather than the faster rate if you're not in a rush. It's just less stress on the cells. And then backing out again, you can actually enable and disable the powerlifting mode, which will allow you to run simple resistive loads like heaters and lights and small fans that might actually exceed that 600 watt max output. But what it does is it lowers the voltage to keep them from tripping the overload protection. Now, I wouldn't use this mode if you're going to be using more complex electronics like TVs and computers, since the low voltage on those kinds of things might be tough on those devices. So personally, I prefer just to kind of keep powerlifting disabled, but it's there if you need it. And then finally, you can configure eco mode, which I just mentioned a few minutes ago. That allows you to configure the auto shutdown timeouts to prevent you from actually leaving the inverter on and running the unit out of power when you're not actually using it. So yeah, the app has all the basics and maybe a few advanced features as well, just in case you need them. All right, so as we saw, this Elite 30 V2 does give you well above average usable capacity out of both the DC and the AC ports. And it functions very well as a nice and quiet UPS system for things like, you know, your gaming computer or even CPAP machines. And I mentioned CPAP machines because I actually get a lot of questions about the compatibility of those with these kinds of power stations. Certainly a good use case for that. And while I suspect that not a lot of people are going to rely on solar charging for a power station in this particular capacity class, if you do plan on solar charging this unit regularly, you would want to be aware that it doesn't seem to wake and charge on its own from a completely powered down state. So the simple solution is just to remember to either power it back on in the morning or simply unplug and replug the solar cable and it'll begin charging as it should normally. And also that 200 watt solar input spec is more than suitable for getting this Elite 30 fully topped off from 0 to 100 in just a few hours or less with decent sun conditions. So what kinds of use cases is this Elite 30 V2 best for? Well, it's obviously great for recharging all of your portable electronics. It's kind of a no-brainer use case, but also things like running small fans and lights, running a DC fridge for a weekend camping trip, you know, or even smaller AC loads like electric blankets, for example. And as I stated previously, it also makes sense as a little UPS for computers, internet routers, and yeah, CPAP machines. So how much does this little guy cost? Well, BLUETTI is just now releasing the Elite 30 and it's available for pre-orders on their early bird sale pricing of just $199. And that pricing, as I understand it, will be effective until at least the end of August this year, which is 2025. But they did also provide me a discount code to share with you that'll knock that price down just a little bit more to $189, which I think is going to be the lowest price that you're going to be able to find this at for the foreseeable future. And I think that's an extremely solid deal from a top tier brand on a unit that does offer a 5-year warranty. And per usual, I'll leave a link to this Elite 30 V2 along with that discount code down in the description below if you're interested in taking advantage of that early bird pre-order pricing. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps it up. And hey, if you found this video helpful or informative in any way, I'd very much appreciate it if you'd consider clicking that like button for me down below, if you think I've earned it. And I absolutely do appreciate that you spent some of your valuable time with me today, and I do hope you'll consider coming back and joining me for the next one. Until then, we are more than halfway through the summer, so get out there and have some fun.